Hello, everyone. I wanted to begin this video by quoting a poem that I memorized many years ago. See if you've heard it. Pile the bodies high at Austerlitz and Waterloo. Shovel them under and let me work. I am the grass. I cover all. And pile them high at Gettysburg and Verdun. Shovel them under and let me work. 2 years, 10 years, 100 years. Passengers asked the conductor, "What is this place? Where are we now?" "I am the grass. Let me work." Well, this is obviously about battlefields. It was written by Carl Sandburg in 1918, but it really gripped me when I heard it, and I memorized it. It's a simple poem to memorize, and it stuck with me many, many years. It seemed to put together so well what I feel about the work that I do, the research work, the historical work. I'm a historian. And as you know, if you followed my channel or anything that I do, I work on the historical Jesus, Christian origins, ancient Mediterranean religions. But my focus is very much on Jesus of Nazareth and his movement. And so, even though I do history, which is primarily maybe something you do in libraries, looking up texts and reading and studying, I also have done a lot of archaeology. I'm not a professional archaeologist, but I've participated in archaeology and been part of many excavations related again to what I study. That is, what can we know about Jesus? What can we know about his movement? And archaeology brings in the material evidence. And there is something called landscape archaeology, and that has to do with places and sites and trying to see what light those actual places might shed on events. And when you put those two together, I'm telling you, texts and historical records with sites and artifacts and places, it is an unbelievable combination. I remember when I was 10 years old, my parents took our family to Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, and I was sitting on the back steps waiting for the group to come through. And I began to wonder, are these the original steps from the time of Washington? And it made a difference to me. I wanted to know. And I asked the guide, and the guide said, absolutely, there's no question. Those are the steps. They haven't been replaced or restored. They were formed of a kind of 18th century concrete that can easily last a couple hundred years or longer. But I was so moved by that. I remember putting my hand on the step and thinking, closing my eyes, George Washington walked right here. Why would it matter if the steps had been replaced? I later taught at the College of William and Mary, which is in the middle of Williamsburg, Virginia. So there are plenty of places like that. Some of you know my book, The Jesus Dynasty, which is my take on the historical Jesus after 30 years of work. And I began the book with the narrative of me going to the Holy Land in 1962. I think I was around 16 years old. And I was obsessed with the same question then. I'd read the Bible, I'd gone to church, I'd heard all these places, Garden of Gethsemane and Golgatha and, all the terms, Mount of Olives, Bethany. And I wondered, I knew the Mount of Olives was still the Mount of Olives, but we had a fairly standard guide who took us to all the traditional Christian sites. And I just wondered, well, which of these are really the site? And it did, again, make a difference to me. So there's a historical reason for that, because if you're in the wrong place, the place is not going to give you the insight that the correct place will give you. And sometimes it can be very important for interpretation and understanding. But the other thing is something of the heart here. I'll give you another stray example that just comes to mind. There are hundreds in my head that I could think of if I sit down and begin thinking of places I've been all over the world. But I was in Rome, and I had this amazing guide, a historian, taking me around Rome. And he showed us this newly excavated area think it's open now to the public, of the original Roman Forum in the center of Rome. And that would be the place where Julius Caesar was stabbed to death. And you can actually see the steps where the texts tell us he fell and bled to death. And I was just so moved by that. I remember I couldn't, it was fenced off. You couldn't go up to the steps, but I was just looking at them and I wanted to wait a minute and kind of take it in. I've taken hundreds of students to Jerusalem over the years. Many of them are my students in Christian origins. And they always want to know, Dr. Tabor, but is this the place? So I know what I'm describing here is going to also be something that many of you feel or think as well. So let me share my screen and tell you what I have in mind here. I don't know if you'll remember, but back in September, I went to this conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the International Symposium on Archaeology and the Bible. It was number 8, and it's sponsored by Veritas International University. And it was a who's who of archaeologists and historians. And I gave 3 lectures, and I've already reproduced for you 2 of them on my YouTube channel. And both of them have drawn a lot of attention. One was on the toilets or the latrines at Qumran, the site of the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you might remember that. The other one, the second one, was a Jesus hideout in Jordan that I began to wonder might be a place where he spent the last winter of his life. And that was something I explored and had discovered myself. And I think that has over 100,000 views. It's people are very interested in that kind of thing. So the 3 lectures that I did were all part of this series that I created called Texts and Sites. So you get the idea. You read the text, and then you go to the sites. And in some cases, you dig the sites. So in this third presentation, giving you what I gave at the conference, because there were no recordings allowed, crucifixions in Herodian Jerusalem. So the question is, Jesus was crucified under the Roman prefect or procurator, Pontius Pilate, I think around the year 30 CE. Where did that take place? So I'm calling this locating the crucifixion site of Jesus and why it matters. And I'll talk about why it matters at the end, but let's try some location first. And you can already tell that I think it does matter. So here's a map, Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. It's actually taken from my book, The Jesus Dynasty, and I commissioned this map to be made a certain way that would illustrate things that I work on, like the Talpiot tombs, the Tomb of the Shroud, the judgment seat of Pilate, and so forth, that you won't find on a lot of maps. So on this map, I have 2 crucifixion sites, the 2 main contenders. And by far, the number 1 is right here where I have the cursor circling, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And according to the standard theory, the tradition of the church since the 4th century, and even most scholars, this church is built over the place where Jesus was crucified. Now, I'm not convinced this is the site where it happened. In fact, I don't think it's the site. But according to the theory, and this is the tradition of the church, and it draws millions of people as tourists, to the idea that Jesus was tried here at what was called the Antonia Fortress, the kind of barracks in the lower level where the Romans abused him that night until Pilate came and performed the judgment. And then he walked down what's called the Via Dolorosa that cuts down to the church, and there he was crucified. So it's on the here's the city of Jerusalem, as you can see, and it's just on the north outside the wall. According to this theory, it was outside the wall at the time of Jesus' death in 30, and this later wall was built, the third wall as it's called, under Agrippa, much later in the first century. Because we do know in the Gospels, at least the tradition is, that Jesus was crucified outside the city. So it would qualify in that way if this is indeed the line of the wall in the first century. The second contender is Gordon's Calvary to the north, right outside Damascus Gate and up to the north. And that is favored by many non-Catholics. It's not like Catholics go here and Protestants here, but I think very few Catholics go here. This is mainly a site that biblically oriented people go to. And you can see more here. I'll show you some slides that you can see why people are drawn to it. But all the scholars agree based on the archaeology, and I also hold this view that that cannot be the site. So I have another site in mind. So let's take a look at my slides and we'll begin. This is a different map. This is the Oxford map. I love this map. That's the traditional site. Gordon's Calvary would be right about here. It's not marked on this map. And the judgment of Jesus would be the Antonia Fortress right here. So here are a couple texts. Mark 15:16. I want to use our earliest text, Mark chapter 16. The soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the praetorium. Remember, that's just a translation. And they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple robe, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they struck his head with a reed and spat on him and knelt down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. So that's the account after Pontius Pilate condemned Jesus of what the soldiers did before taking him out to be crucified. And then if we go on to read in verse 21, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who is coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgatha, which means the place of a skull. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy yourself and build the temple in 3 days, save yourself," and so forth. Come down from the cross. So here we have several interesting things. Where is the praetorium? Where did they lead him out to crucify him? On the way, a passerby, where would he be coming from? And then Golgotha. Well, as it turns out, there is an ossuary in Jerusalem. And I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to give all the details. But even if you don't know much Greek, you can probably tell that that is Alexandros, and it means the ossuary of Alexander. And also, we've got it written in Hebrew, and he's a Cyreneite. He's from Cyrene. So this ossuary or bone box, which held the skeletal remains of two individuals, Simon and his son Alexander from Cyrene, was discovered in a tomb. It was identified by Eleazar Sukenik, who not too long after this was involved in the Dead Sea Scroll identifications and discoveries. And you look at it and you wonder, did this hold the bones of the ones mentioned in the Gospel of Mark? The famous Simon of Cyrene, who was carrying the cross. So we don't know for sure, but it seems like there's a good probability of that. And there is something about gazing at it and thinking about, could this be it? So back to the place. Where did it happen? John and Mark often go together because Mark is our earliest synoptic gospel, but the Gospel of John, believe it or not, maybe you're not aware of this, but the last chapters of John, particularly chapters 18 and 19, appear to have a lot of detailed historical information that checks out, a lot of things that Mark doesn't know. And one of the things is they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. Caiaphas is the high priest. The praetorium is where the Romans do their official judgment. So if we can locate that, that's going to help. And it was early, but they, the Jewish enemies of Jesus, did not enter the praetorium so that they might not be defiled. This is ritual defilement, but might eat the Passover. So they've already gone through the different purification rites to eat the Passover that evening. And here's Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, the governor, we call him. He goes out to them. So the praetorium is something that you go in and out of. And he says, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Later in the account, chapter 19, Pilate hears their accusations. He goes in and out several times. If you read it through, it's very detailed. And he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Pavement, and in Hebrew, Golgatha. Now, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about that John gives. I don't think this is made up. I think there is this tradition of a place. It's called the Pavement, in Hebrew, Golgatha, and it gives the time of day about the 6th hour. So Jesus is condemned at this place and then taken out from this place, which is actually then the praetorium, and he starts carrying his cross to another place in Hebrew called Golgotha. So again, we get these place names: tried, crucified. And 2 others were crucified with him, and they put a sign over his head. And notice this: for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And the idea is that people are going to see this and read it. It's written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So wherever the place of crucifixion is, it's outside the city, but maybe on a very public road. And that's why they could grab Simon of Cyrene and have him help Jesus carry the cross, because he's been so beaten up through those early morning hours that he probably can hardly walk. Now, here's a traditional view of the praetorium. You don't get a sense here of exactly where it would be, but some kind of a raised platform. So this would be the Pavement or Golgotha. Here you've got the Jewish enemies outside. They don't come in, and here's Jesus, and he's being judged at the judgment seat. This is the famous Ecce Homo, remember, behold the man. And he's led away from here down steps to be crucified. Now, what's really interesting about this painting is that there has now been discovered in Jerusalem on the western city wall, and I'll show you a map in a minute. And this was excavated by Magen Broshi in the 1970s, who's now passed away, a friend of mine. And Shimon Gibson was just a kid, my colleague that I work with in Jerusalem, excavating on Mount Zion. And he used to put his lunch up here. So there was soil all the way up. That's why you've got this growth here, because of the moisture in these rocks. And you can kind of see where the soil was. We have pictures of that. So all this was removed. And lo and behold, you have steps going up. And these are 1st century, absolutely, from the time of Jesus, going into a wall. Well, this wall is later. You can see how it's been put in here. This is a Turkish wall, but right here, you actually have Herodian stones from the time of Jesus still remaining, and these bedrock foundations for steps going into a gate. And then up on the platform, there's a flat area here. This is also 1st century masonry from the time of Jesus. So if you think of this line down here and this, you're in the original spot. And as green, as grassy as it is, I'm thinking of that poem again: I am the grass, I cover all. Now, nobody goes to this site. If you go with me to Israel, I'll take you to this site. We'll spend some time here, because once you explore it and see what it really is, This could be one of the holiest sites for Christians, the very spot where Jesus was condemned to death. Now, look here. As you go up, see where we did? We walked up the steps and up. You've got the actual pavement. This has been robbed out and destroyed over the years. But these pavement stones right here are still in situ, as we say, and they are the first century pavement of a platform. And this is Herod's palace. This is the gate on the south leading into the palace of Herod. And Pontius Pilate is not going to stay at the barracks at the Fortress Antonia. That's for the troops to take care of, to see if there's any unrest during Passover. He's going to be at Herod's palace. And Herod's in town too, according to the Gospel of Luke. And the palace actually has two separate wings with fountains and gardens in between. And so I assume that the ruler of Galilee is in one wing and Pilate's probably in the southern wing, very close to the seat of Roman government. Every Roman city has this seat of government if it's a province. I've been to Corinth, and the Bema, this is called a Bema, the judgment seat, is very visible there, and it looks a lot like this. It's smaller, but it's the same kind of thing. And when a Roman governor sits on this platform, there's a canopy and a table and so forth, and he pronounces the judgment. It's the judgment of the Emperor of Rome. So the Emperor of Rome is putting his stamp at this spot on the death of Jesus. So this is one of those places that when I went to Jerusalem, think about it, in 1962, I would have just seen a hillside up against a Turkish wall. And this has become one of my favorite sites in Jerusalem. Let me go back and show you this again. You can imagine just sitting up here and looking out at sundown and watching the sunset to the west and just imagining everything as it took place. So here is the artist that I used for the Jesus Dynasty. It has a lot of his illustrations in it. And this is one of the color ones that I have. And I asked him to reproduce what he thought it might have been like, because he's what's called an archaeological artist who specializes in reproducing archaeological scenes and sites from the evidence. So you can see the bedrock here that's still there, and then the stones going up and the steps. And there's our figure, Jesus, the lone figure, Roman soldiers guarding the crowds down below. I'm telling you, folks, this is the site. So we've got that, but then where did they take him? So the main majority opinion, the traditional idea, the one that all the crowds flock to, is this is where Jesus was tried. It's the Church of St. Anne today, and you can go and visit the pavement there. And then he was walked down the Via Dolorosa to the site over which is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And our site is right here, the site that I'm talking about, of the Praetorium. The Oxford map has it up here because they didn't know where it was when this was made, but now we know it's right here. So this is a model of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. It's at the Israel Museum now, and I always take my tours and my students here. And they're speculating that outside of the city wall on the north was this rock quarry with tombs, and Jesus was crucified up on top of this prominent rock right here, and the church is built over it. So that's the theory. This is what the church looks like. It's been destroyed and rebuilt in various stages over the years. Here I am in front of it. This is the entrance you go in. Over to the right is that rock or place of crucifixion, they think. And then the tomb is over here. They're actually very close together. A lot about it doesn't fit the account, but the basic problem I have with it is there's no evidence for this until 300 years after Jesus' death. And all of a sudden we say, this is the site. And I think there's some earlier evidence. So, you can go to the time of Constantine, and it was Constantine's mother who declared this to be the site. But I don't think it holds up scientifically. I don't know anything about this site that backs it up. We do know that Hadrian, after the second revolt, which ended in 135 CE or AD, dedicate this area as a pagan temple. And that's one of the main arguments, if not the main argument, that he wanted to put a pagan temple over the site of Jesus' crucifixion to get rid of the idea of its holiness. But we know that there was a tomb here, and it was the tomb of John Hyrcanus, the great Maccabean leader, the greatest of the great. And it's mentioned a number of times in Josephus right at this location. And that would make even more sense. Hadrian's not worried about the Christians. He's putting down the Jews. And who would be the preeminent symbol of Jewish independence and rebellion, if not the great John Hyrcanus, the Maccabean warrior, priest, and king? So I personally am not at all convinced by this. I just don't think it fits the text that we're going to look at in a minute or anything we know about the site. The other one is Gordon's Calvary to the north. And here's what it looks like. And you can see why General Gordon, a British general of great fame and history, he was actually having breakfast with the Spaffords up on the city wall by the Damascus Gate, and he spotted this. And as the story goes, he said, that looks kind of like a skull, and it's a hill that looks like a skull. Maybe that's where Jesus was crucified. And he was Protestant, and he was thinking of an alternative. And there's tombs up here. So, maybe this is it. And lo and behold, near the place of all these caverns and caves, if you go on down and around, you've got this tomb, and it has a rolling stone that went across, and it's got an entrance, and you go in, and it kind of fits the Easter story. The women come to the tomb, and John and the beloved disciple come, and they stoop in, and so forth. So lots of people go there. Some people call it the Garden Tomb. That's really what it's called, more than Gordon's Calvary today. And it's worth visiting. I've been there many times, but I don't think it's the place. First of all, this is an Iron Age tomb. So one of the main criterion for identifying the place of crucifixion is that nearby the place was a tomb. But then it goes on to say, in our only account that we have, the Gospel of John, that it had never been used. It wasn't even finished yet. And this is an Iron Age tomb that was finished centuries before Jesus was even born. And there are no other tombs right in this area that could qualify. And what I'm going to suggest is Jesus was led to the north and through what we now call Jaffa Gate and up along the city, really along the Via Dolorosa, but out the gate right here, which is today called St. Stephen's Gate. So he's taken here, out this way, and up to the Mount of Olives. That's the location I would like to suggest. And this slide is taken from the rooftop that would be just to the west of the Temple Mount. And you get a view of the Mount of Olives right here. Now, when I went to the Mount of Olives in 1962, none of these buildings were there. And the tower buildings were there, but there was only the little hotel that we stayed in, but none of the residential buildings. So it looked a lot more. I'll show you a picture of it here. It looked a lot more like this when I went. So there was a hotel up here. So if there are crucifixions up here, you'll see them from anywhere you are. And that's why the Romans chose this spot. So let's look at some texts. I want to give credit to Dr. N.F. Hutchison, Palestine Exploration Quarterly, notes on our Lord's tomb, and then further notes on our Lord's tomb. And he seems to be the first to argue in modern times that the site of crucifixion and the tomb in which he was first placed, notice, the unfinished tomb, that's not going to be a permanent tomb. They put him there because it's near Passover and the festival's coming. Where do you put a dead body? Where do you put a corpse when it's time to eat the Passover? It had to be east of the city, he argued. He quoted Hebrews 13. We'll get to that. And he puts forth a number of other arguments. It's on a high road, visible to all, leading past gardens. The scene could be witnessed afar off by bystanders. It's on a main road upon which throngs of pilgrims arrive for the feast. The large throngs of people, and I mean hundreds of thousands, come all the way down from Galilee to Jericho, up to Bethany to Jerusalem. Their first view of the city was when they crest over the Mount of Olives. A lot of pilgrims talk about that. So here's Hebrews. Hebrews 13, 10 through 13. This is the only place in the New Testament that might locate it geographically in terms of north, south, east, west, or whatever. It speaks of going outside the city gate. Now, Jerusalem has a number of gates, but when you say outside the city gate, and then you mention a specific altar that's not in the temple, but outside the camp, you're talking about always the east. The ancient tabernacle only had one gate, and that was on the east. And so the temple itself, even though there are entrances around for the crowds and steps going up, the gate of the temple is the eastern gate. So that seems to be what the writer of Hebrews is describing, the eastern gate leading to the Mount of Olives. Now, how do we know that? Because the Mifkad altar is located on the slopes. And we know this from all kinds of rabbinic sources. Now, you might not know about this altar, but it's a special altar east of the temple on the Mount of Olives. And it's where this red heifer was burned to provide these ashes for ritual cleansing. You could not have the temple without these ashes. The Talmud and the Mishnah are clear that this altar was located 2,000 cubits outside the eastern gates on the slope of the Mount of Olives. So the author of the book of Hebrews is writing before the temple falls. So this is a first century account of where Jesus was crucified. And it says that Christians should follow him outside the camp, meaning leave the temple, go outside the camp. I think it's metaphorical, and join Jesus at the new Christian altar, so to speak, which would be the site of Jesus' death. And Hebrews makes a big point about Jesus being a priest and going outside and suffering outside the gate and so forth. I think the only gate that makes sense is the eastern gate in terms of this passage. So for me, that kind of identifies where we ought to start looking. But there's more. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the time, says that during the Jewish revolt, 66 to 70, as many as 500 Jewish victims per day were crucified before the wall of the city. And we think that means the Mount of Olives. They're camped on Mount Scopus, and they're overlooking the city. The whole idea is to terrorize the city and the captives inside. Look what happens to anyone who rebels against Rome. We also have Quintilian, a Roman writer of the first century. He said, "We crucify criminals on the most frequented roads where the greatest number of people can look, for every punishment has less to do with the offense than with the example." So the Mount of Olives would be the place where the whole city could look and see these three crosses on the afternoon of Passover as an example to everybody. Don't go against Rome. So here's the picture again. It's a very poignant thing to even imagine that Jesus would have gone down the Mount of Olives on the donkey and up carrying the cross on the Mount of Olives. I spent a lot of time up here. I think I can even locate the approximate place where the crucifixion would have been, and also a tomb just over the backside here a bit that could well fit the description of the tomb. Now, when you go up the path, this is what it's like, and you see this bedrock. These two paths have not moved. And here you see the modern city behind, but look, here's the old city wall right there. And the temple would have stood right there. And this is the spot that I've located almost at the very top. And it's a very kind of prominent outcropping of bedrock. Again, bedrock doesn't move. And then you're right at the summit and you can see the buildings right here. And it's a flat and level area. I don't know the exact spot, but if it was the Mount of Olives, could well be this spot. So I had my artist Beloge draw the scene. I gave him the specifications, and here's what he came up with. And I'm telling you, I look at that and my heart is strangely moved. He was very accurate, even made the victims naked, obviously, with their backs to us. And then people coming in would come right down the path and would see and go into the city, and anyone in the temple could also see the Mount of Olives. When you're in here, you can see the summit of the Mount of Olives. So I think there's a lot of evidence that this is the place. Now, we know a lot more about crucifixion. It was done naked. This is one of the few paintings you're going to find of naked crucifixion. This is the heel bone. It's a model. This is the actual bone, but it's a model of another crucified victim that was discovered in Jerusalem, north of the city at Gavat HaMivtar in a tomb. And the nail was still in the heel. They probably couldn't get it out. And there's a piece of wood that was sort of left to hold the head of the nail. But at least we know they didn't go through the foot. If you put a nail through the foot, you would break all these bones and rip all these blood vessels. But the heel bone is very secure. It's the largest bone in the foot. So this is a drawing of what it would have been like. It's kind of like stirrups, and you putting all your weight on there, holding your weight. Arms were then tied, and we think these hands, this drawing doesn't have it because we've just learned this. We think the hands were pulled up on the back, and then they're tacked from the back with just little nails so that you couldn't begin to pull loose because the ropes would begin to loosen. So that's what we know about crucifixion. And then the burial. Here's something interesting that you may have not noticed the details of. Now, the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, okay? And in the garden, a new tomb where no one had ever been laid. So Mark agrees with that. It's an unfinished tomb. And because the Jewish day of preparation was near, notice this phrase, everybody misses it. As the tomb was close at hand, or since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So Jesus is put in a temporary, unfinished tomb. Didn't belong to Joseph of Arimathea, didn't belong to the burial party. John doesn't assert that at all. He said just happened to be nearby, so they took him off the cross and they put him in an unfinished tomb and blocked it up. And when Mary Magdalene comes early Sunday morning, she comes alone, according to John 20, and the stone's already rolled away. There's no angels. There's nobody in the tomb saying, he is risen, go to Galilee, nothing like that. Read John 20, the first 10 verses, and put it with this. And it's what you would expect. The burial party goes probably Saturday night, and they remove the body because it was just stashed there, you might say, to protect it from predators. And then he was reburied by Joseph of Arimathea. So if you can find the estate of Joseph of Arimathea, he would have been buried by Joseph, probably in a family tomb that this wealthy man provided. Now, Matthew is the only one who says, laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. Now, this is clearly an interpolation of Matthew. Mark doesn't have this. It didn't say it's his own tomb and that he had hewn it out. It doesn't even make sense. What are the chances that a stray character like Joseph of Arimathea, who's a secret disciple of Jesus and on the Sanhedrin, according to Mark, would, oh, I happen to have a tomb right near where they crucified Jesus. How convenient. I'll put him there. Doesn't even make sense. And if John knew that, he would have said, and he went and put him in a tomb that he happened to have there. That's not what he said. He says he did it because the tomb was nearby. And the Passover is coming. You don't have time to worry about where you're going to put him. You got to put him somewhere. You see the idea? So if you take out his own and which he had hewn, which Matthew, I think, added, he laid it in a new tomb and rolled a stone on it, then, it's the same story. So why would Matthew add this? Because he wants to fulfill a prophecy in Isaiah 53 that says he made his grave with a rich man. And Joseph is said to be a rich man. And Matthew thinks, bingo, wow. This fulfills Isaiah. Jesus is the suffering servant who dies for the sins of his nation and so forth. So this is a theological interpolation. Here is a tomb on the Mount of Olives that I am very interested in. It's the only one I know that has a rolling stone and also has early Christian graffiti in it from the Byzantine period. And I'm not going to talk about that right now, but just want you to know it's interesting. I'm not even going to tell you exactly where it is because I don't want people going there. But it is a tomb on the Mount of Olives. Not easy to find, by the way. So here's something I've been thinking about that's new, beyond the Mount of Olives idea. And I discovered this in 2018, just hiking around and looking. And I was in the Hinnom Valley and walking around here, and I noticed this hill right here, and I went up on top of it. And as I went up, I saw this sign, Bible Hill. It's Gavat HaTanakh, the hill of the Bible. It's not an official name. But this hill is a piece of bedrock rising up pretty high. And it's noted even in the Hebrew Bible, it's the border between the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin anciently. And it's also the watershed for the Jerusalem area, where the water flows to the east and to the west. So it's notable, but tourists just go there to look at the wildflowers and get a view of the city. But here's what it looks like. So I walked up and I see this bedrock up on top. This is St. Andrew's Church. It's a hotel and a guest center and a church. I've stayed there before. But as I got to the top and kind of looked around, where am I now? And I looked back, and here is that western wall of Jerusalem. Look. And that Praetorium judgment seat of Pilate is right there. Right there. Look at that. And I thought, if Jesus was judged here, and there is a main road here coming up from the south, and then I started thinking about the story in the Gospels where Pilate is told that Jesus is dead, and he sends some of his officials to go check. And you can see they would have just come down the road and up here, and then they went back and maybe told him. So again, I was trying to imagine the situation. Here's another view. So there's the Mount of Olives, which is still the site that I favor absolutely because it's more prominent. But I'm thinking about this. But there needs to be a tomb nearby. And in fact, just down the hill over to the left here, there are some tombs unexcavated, as well as some that are excavated by Gabi Barkai, and they're very famous. Ketef Hinnom, it's called. And some crucifixion nails found, as I recall. So there's a lot. My student, Todd West, is investigating this for me. He's come up with reams and reams of material. So maybe I'll do another lecture in a few years and I'll tell you, well, actually, that wasn't the tomb. And I've got a fourth idea or a fifth idea. I don't know. Sometimes when I give this lecture or talk about this idea to my students and to others, they get very excited, particularly if they're more conservative readers of the Gospels, because it seems like I'm presenting things that verify the account of the Gospels in terms of this basic framework. And many of them would then see it as kind of a proof of the Bible sort of thing, which I don't really see it that way at all. I see it more as we have texts and we have sites, and we're trying to mesh them together and figure out what makes the most sense. But I still think these texts have to be handled critically, and you would read them like you'd read any other documents, and they're full of theology and they're full of myth making. For example, if Jesus is temporarily put in an emergency in a tomb, and that tomb is found empty Sunday morning by Mary Magdalene, all that really means, according to what I presented, is the burial party came after the Passover on Saturday night. They're going to leave the body rotting for another 12 hours, and they're going to take the body and bury it permanently. Well, that wouldn't be a conclusion that the Gospels uphold at all, because they have angels appearing and earthquakes and people being struck dead and so forth. So the legendary material, I think, is pretty obvious, and it really depends on your view of history. But I do think the Gospels were written in the first century. I think they're in touch with the kind of evidence that you have in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John, chapters 18 and 19, notice I'm saying, because that's where you get all this detail. And they could serve as clues to trying to put together a whole picture. And you begin to get a more realistic picture of the setting and the scene when Jesus was crucified in April of the year 70, which I take as a historical fact. So I leave you with that, and I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you next time.